Right, I'm back hopefully, and we are doing sharing. Yay. Very quickly finding the right screen to share. I'm sorry about this. Um, Here we go. Right, hopefully you can all see that.
We
And
can see it.
Perfect. I'd like to talk about some work that I've been doing for about the past 15 years, which is a huge amount of time. And what it has ended up being is, I think, without a doubt, the largest measurement system on the entire internet. There's nothing quite like the size of this system. It's enormous. And it gives amazing insights that are otherwise not clearly visible. We all know that India has about four massive service providers: Reliance Jio, Bharti Airtel, um, second Bharti Airtel, actually, Vodafone and Idea. But how many users lie behind each of these services? Well, oddly enough, I can tell you roughly. It's about, 5 to 10% accurate. But Reliance Jio appears to have some 300 million users. Bharti Mobile, Bharti Airtel, between the two, around 270 million, Vodafone 27 million, and so on. Um, we have this data for every country, for every network service provider, breaking down where users actually have and derive their service from. But as well as just raw numbers, we can also look at how are we doing with some certain facts of technology adoption. V6 is a classic. We knew way, way, way back in about 1990, 24, 25 years ago, that we were going to run out of V4 addresses. And in a panicked move, the engineering fraternity at the time, the Internet Engineering Task Force, developed this new protocol, IP version 6. And the early versions of this were fielded in around 96, 97, around 20 years ago. And then we just waited. We just waited. We thought, naively as it turns out, that adoption would just happen because IPv6 is so good that everyone would just use it, right? It's brilliant, yeah? But that wasn't the case. We just didn't do anything. And even in 2011, when we started to really run out of V4 addresses, nothing happened. Nothing. It's as if we're kind of living on a vacuum and just not aware of the fact that the currency of networking addresses were incredibly, incredibly short supply and no one was moving in V6. India, oddly enough, became a bit of a mover and shaker in this space because in 2015, I think it was, when Reliance Jio wanted to do a massive push with a mobile service at an incredibly low cost. Their aim was to provide internet services to everybody in India, everybody. And it was pretty clear that you can't do that on V4. It's just too big a market. There wasn't enough V4 addresses. V4 addresses had been exhausted, years before. And so the only answer was actually to use V6. And so around that period, 2015, 2016, a number of very, very large mobile service providers in India started planning the same thing. Let's roll this out using V6 as a backbone. And what this graph actually shows is that across that period, 2016 to the end of 2017, just 24 months, the amount of IPv6 in India rose from nothing to around 60% of the entire user population. And today, it's around 80%. It's a massive program. One of the few, I think, astonishing successes. Moving large networks to new technology is a challenge. And oddly enough, this one is a particular success story for those providers, and it's an amazing achievement. Um, we also can measure inside the infrastructure of the network. We're well aware that, everything starts with the domain name system. The DNS lies at the heart of the entire internet. The problem is, of course, that if you can lie in the DNS, if you can cheat and steal and send bad answers, a lot of things go down with you. It's a mess. And so what we really need to do is to actually encourage folk to check that the answer they're getting from the DNS is the right answer. The technology we have for this is DNSSEC, security for DNS, which associates an answer in the DNS with signatures. But what I'm interested in is, okay, so you've got a domain name and you've signed it. How many users are protected? If you get given a bad answer, will you even notice that it's a bad answer? And again, interestingly for India, around 60% of users in India sit behind service providers that use DNSSEC to validate the answer. Again, an astonishing achievement because as anyone's ever grappled with DNSSEC, it's not easy. There is a lot of work you have to do to actually make this happen. This measurement system is actually capable of plotting this out day by day, and I've been measuring it day by day for now a little over 11 years, and that's the result for India. Massive push in 2019, taking it from close to nothing to around 55% of users. A few service providers just jumped in within that 12-month period. Again, an amazing effort. The latest thing we're all concerned about, routing security. Again, it's an infrastructure problem, but if I can inject bad routes into the network, then I can subvert traffic and do all kinds of terrible things. And there's been a push from a number of areas to say, well, we've really got to do two things. One, we've actually got to create cryptographic objects that describe what you should be seeing in the routing system, these so-called route objects. And this graph plots the adoption of that technology, signed ROAs, over the last few years. And again, in India, the big push seemed to occur in late 2020, when today around 80% of all the routes that originate in the Indian subcontinent, all 80% of those routes are actually signed with cryptographic authorization, signed with ROAs. That's brilliant. Fantastic. Does anyone use it? If you get a route, receive a route in BGP, and it fails that test, will you throw it away? Will you drop that route? Fascinatingly, in 2023, for 9 months, a number of large service providers in India actually turned it on and tried it. And it was quite good. Up to 50% of users could not get to destinations where the routing security information was saying, that's bad. And then everyone just turned it off. Now almost no one is protected in India. Anyone can get to a bad destination because although all the routes or the good routes are signed, they're not being used to actually filter the BGP routing advertisements. And folk can get to bad places just as easily as they can get to good. I don't know what happened in September 2023, but whatever it was probably not the best of things to have happened. So this is kind of a quick insight as to how much you can glean about the state of the network by using a large-scale measurement system. And there is so much that we can measure, so much. You know, all of this computerized stuff, it's just bursting with numbers. The real question, I think, of all of this is, how do you apply a sieve to that and sift out what measurements are useful versus what are merely distractions? I've given you a few whole of network metrics. And so they don't talk about your experience or my experience or any other individual sample. They try to generalize across to literally everyone. And whole of network metrics can often inform policy about where we should place our effort, where we should do research, what kind of topics need to be addressed. But they won't help you to solve a problem with your network that might be occurring in a couple of hours. They won't help you in diagnosing operational incidents. For that, you need an entirely different kind of network that effectively does directed samples that can actually tell you what's happening there and then in the network in individual use cases. And there's a case for both types of measurements, but they are very, very different measurements. Um, of course, the network itself is a massive system, and you can indeed measure it from the point of view of systemic behavior. How stable is routing? How stable is the DNS? And look at the system from the point of view of the system as a whole. But that's not the way users see it. What users want to know is, can I get to where I want to go to? Is this URL working? Can I download that video? Can I, hook into Netflix or whatever it is? What is the user experience in using the network? Looking at the network, if you will, as a responsive black box, how well is it able to respond to user needs? And last and not least, of course, in this kind of breakdown is the engineering view. If you're running that network, then it's useful to understand if the components that you're using are actually doing what they're intended to do. Where is congestion? Where is routing failing? Where am I getting, breakpoints in the network? How are my components standing up? And of course, all three of those metrics have their role and different applications. And last and not least is this whole thing about snapshots versus time series. I've showed you some time series measurements that occur across up to 2 decades in one case, long time series that tend to show the sort of evolution of behavior, the sort of results of steady work over a long period of time. What's the baseline and how is that changing? But of course, that doesn't help you to debug a problem. For that, you need more instantaneous metrics, snapshot metrics. What's the network doing right now? Where is my traffic going right now? And again, it's an entirely different way of looking at the system. And they're two very, very different sort of sides of measurement. So whenever you're trying to set something up, figuring out what approach you're going to use is almost the first and most basic question. And then once you've kind of worked that out, you've then got to figure out how. Um, there's passive measurement where you use a network management protocol and hook into, active network devices such as routers, hook into your service platforms and actually get them to report on what they think they're doing. What's the CPU rate of a server? How much free memory? What's the disk space, et cetera, et cetera. Classic system management stuff. Versus active measurement. If you really want to know how the DNS is working, ask it to resolve a name or two or a million. Probe the network, push the network, and see how the network responds. Actively push at the network and work out whether the network is performing according to expectations or whether it isn't. There's a role for passive and active measurement systems, and they are very, very different. We're also seeing these days this whole sort of rise of dedicated probe points versus enrollment kind of measurements. Many of you might be familiar with the RIPE Atlas program. There's another one run by CADA called ARC. There used to be a really good one funded by the NSF, the National Science Foundation in the US, called Planet Labs, where you push out boxes, Linux boxes, tiny Linux probes, things that are sort of size of your finger, all kinds of sort of dedicated devices that are programmable. And in essence, the measurement is done by programming these units to actually perform a particular action. Pull down a URL, resolve a domain name, perform a TCP service transfer. That's fine, and there's an extraordinary elasticity in that. But the problem is, of course, that the size of your measurement is limited by the number of probes you got out there. With Atlas, it's still only 10,000 probes, and you're measuring the same 10,000 every time. Even, if you take subsets, it's still from the same pool. The other way of doing this is active enrollment. And this is something we use, and there are a few other folk who have gone down the same path, where they co-opt a user, either deliberately or unsuspectingly, and run the code on their machine to perform that measurement. Now, in theory, there are around 5 billion odd users of the internet, some large number. And enrollment allows you to actually gather a subset of the entire internet population. And if you do it right, it's a very, very rich set of potential targets for measurement. The problem is, the problem is that you can only do very limited things on other people's computers. They don't let you in with root level access. No, 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 no. So you've got to instrument other parts of the network. The best you can do with enrollment is to get your subjects to perform astonishingly limited functions and do everything else on the other side. And last and not least, there is deliberate and intentional pre-program measurement. Here's a program, do this, do that, do this, versus what I would call opportunistic measurement, where you observe a behavior and then collect data on that behavior and derive outcomes and conclusions from that. Opportunistic, of course, is incredibly hard to plan for. You just happen to have a server or system at the right place at the right time, whether it's, beside an earthquake that's happened in some particular part of the world or something like that, a cable cut, and you're able to observe what happens as a result of that versus deliberate and intentional measurement that doesn't rely on particular events just sort of opportunistically happening when you're looking. So how did how did I or we in APNIC get into this gig? And it happened 14 years ago now. God, that's a long time, isn't it? 14 years. Ah. At the time, we kind of believed that when the last V4 address had been handed out, the internet was going to hit a really, really big wall. And it was not going to be pretty. It was going to be exceptionally ugly. And we were kind of concerned that we couldn't see much V6 out there. And there was so many lies, distortions, boasts, and mistruths about how much V6 was out there in 2010. We decided to get into the measurement system ourselves. And we started asking sort of what kind of questions would people pay for the answer? What questions were valuable? And very quickly, when you sort of look at those questions, some are more valuable than others. How much traffic uses V6? If I download a few gigs of data, a few terabytes of data, that's a lot of traffic, but it's only me. And it's kind of, well, how important am I? And the answer is, well, not very. If a billion users download even 1 kilobyte using V6, that's a huge amount of traffic. Individually, each user is doing very little. And so traffic is kind of a qualified question. And oddly enough, I don't think it's very informative. The next one which is how many connections use V6. If you have a dual stacked web server, answer in V4, answer in V6, and you then break that out going, well, what's the percentage of connections in V6 versus in V4? If you're in India, it's likely that 80 to 90% of your connections are going to happen to your server across V6 because of the phenomenal amount of V6 deployment in India and the preference to use V6 whenever you can. If you perform precisely the same experiment in, say, United States of America, you might find the number is way, way less than that, 50, 60% at most, because there simply isn't the amount of V6. That's not traffic, that's connections. That's closer to users. How many routes? I'm not sure that's that informative. How many service providers? Well, numerators and denominators. How many service providers are there and how important is the services they provide is kind of what's going to qualify that question. Taking a census of service providers kind of equates Akamai with Geoff's favorite web hosting service, and that's kind of silly because Akamai is way more important than me. And so those kinds of questions need to be qualified extraordinarily. You can look inside the DNS and find the use of records to indicate V6. You can even look at DNS queries. But again, I'm not sure how informative that is. We get closer to the real question when we start talking about end devices, what users have in their hand, what users actually do. Because when you start asking that question, you're really starting to see where the V6 is working and is viable, in the area that you're measuring. But, realistically, all of those questions are parts of the whole. They don't encompass the whole, all of the infrastructure, all at once. And it's kind of interesting that if I ask each of you in this room, here's a URL, you can only get there in V6. If you have V4, won't work. If you have dual stack, it'll work, but you can only get there in V6. And I ask all of you in the room to try and get there. That's an interesting question, because that's an end user experience that says, is everything working? Is the routing working? Is the forwarding working? Is the DNS working? Is the transport working? Is your device working? Is everything equipped with V6 to actually make an end-to-end connection work? And that's almost a very fundamental question with an astonishingly deep answer. Because quite frankly, if I can present you with a V6 only URL, and I can do this a million times, then I'm starting to gain some real insight into the capabilities of the network from what starts with an extraordinarily simple test. So the way these kinds of measurement systems work is you need numbers. You need very, very large numbers, way larger than a set of probes or a set of anchors or, a set of, little devices out there. You really want, excuse me, a statistically significant, subset of users large enough that the sampling makes sense. Now, I could go to an internet, a website for weather in that country, massively popular, the Daily News, whatever it might be. But the issue is when you go and approach those people who run those sites saying, can I put some code on your site? They look at you like they're crazy. And you probably are, because all of a sudden putting third-party code on their web service is something that no webmaster would tolerate. It really is an issue of, will that make my server less resilient? Will you put in bad code? And quite frankly, if you put something on my web system, you get to see all the users of my web service, and I might not like that. And so trying to inject measurement code on massively popular websites only works if you're the web service site yourself. So Google do V6 measurement on Google sites, and they can kind of get away with it because they're Google. But if I put my hand up saying, hey, Google, can I get some JavaScript on your website? I'm sorry, that's just not a question they're willing to answer. So the answer is no, it will not happen. So you need to either be a very popular web service or you've got to think about this differently. So let's rethink this a bit. And as I said, Google can do it because they're Google. Akamai can do it because they're Akamai. But you and I aren't Google. At least I don't think you are. I'm looking very closely at who's in the room, and no one looks like they're Google. No one looks like they're Akamai, and neither am I. So if you're not Google, then maybe you can use Google, because Google has one thing that's actually really, really interesting. When I'm talking about measurement on the scale of millions, tens of millions, hundreds of millions, there's one thing that does that all of the time, and that's ads. I know they're annoying. I know they're ghastly. I know they completely get in the way of any user experience. They're out there, but everyone gets ads, because ads is actually what funds the internet. This whole advertiser funded network is kind of where we are. And there's a massive industry behind it worth literally, I don't know, tens of billions of dollars, maybe into the hundreds or trillions of dollars around advertising. So ads. Ads are interesting. Ads aren't pictures. Ads aren't text. Ads is actually dynamic scripting. The ad server loads this kind of content of script and images. And that script is HTML5. And that script can do a reasonable amount of things in a limited space. And one of the things it can do is to load alternative images, load other bits of URLs and display them. So you can't, it's not an arbitrary programming library. It's not a free-form version of a constrained compute environment. It's limited to object loading, and the runtime library is very limited. And you can do things when the ad is impressed. You can load some things when the mouse hovers over it, and you can do things when the user clicks on the ad, and that's fine. And if I'm a measurement guy, I don't care if you hover over my ad or click on my ad. As soon as the ad gets loaded, I want the script to do something. So to minimize the interactions with the user and to increase the reap of these ads, I use on-load scripting in an ad. Um, and so what we do is we instrument the target host via an ad script. So the user, when it receives the ad, starts running some HTML5. And what that HTML5 does, very simply, is say, here's some URLs, go fetch them. That's it. Now, the URLs we give are very, very, very carefully constructed. Caching is your enemy in measurement. You don't want to see how well the cache is performing unless that's the object of the measurement. So what we do is you load up unique URLs that have never been seen before. The caching will never work. So the end user ends up talking to a server that I operate. And instead of instrumenting the user, because instrumenting the user in an ad environment is impossible. It's a security nightmare. It's never going to happen. We instrument the server. And the server, which has basically got a clear end-to-end channel to the user, then infers all of the host properties over in the user by the way in which the server interacts with the user. Now, ads are brilliant because it's a failed ad system if it delivers the same million users every day. Same, same, same. Ads actually try very, very, very hard to get me new users all of the time. So I get very little repeat bias in this measurement set. It's constantly trolling through their database to bring out new users and present, my tired old ad to them. And that's great because that's precisely what I want. The other thing is that ads are biased towards closure. So the whole economy is actually based around these extraordinary bid prices for a click. And advertisers will pay up to $100 for a click. I don't know who's got that money. Car insurance evidently is a big one. And in America, pool cleaning equipment, $100 a click. Who would have thought? But not me, not me. I do not want clicks. I do not want to pay for clicks. Clicks are the enemy because they're just expensive and they tell me nothing. I just want impressions. I just want the ad to load. And please don't click on it because that costs. So impressions are way, way cheaper than clicks, about 1,000 times cheaper. And so oddly enough, for the measurement work, impressions are exactly what I'm after. So what I do, fresh eyeballs means a constant flow of unique endpoints. So it's not measurement bias by repetition. You're constantly searching through the pool of users to find new people to present the ad to. And that's all the ad network does that. I do nothing. I have a preference for pay by impression, not pay by click. So the advertising channel tries really, really hard to sort of get more clicks. Yet my ad is trying really, really hard to say I don't like clicks. So it gives me many, many more impressions than a normal ad because most folk don't click on my ad, which is exactly what I want. The other thing is ads are phenomenally tunable. Time of day, physical location, keyword context. And so you can sort of tune the ad for all kinds of parameters. Now, I want generalized broad distribution. So oddly enough, the way I do this is I actually split the day up into 24 one-hour segments and run 24 different campaigns, one for each hour. That way, the ad network is trying desperately hard to work 24 hours a day. And even if it achieves its objective at 3 in the morning, when 4 o'clock comes around, it's a new problem and a new objective. And so you tend to even out the ad impressions. We can also localize by country, or if you wanted, even by network service provider, but we don't do that. we're trying to get an even impression of the entire network. So I think I've already said most of this. We do a bidding based on ad impressions, not clicks. We run 24 one-hour campaigns. We tend to target some economies which are otherwise difficult for the ad system to get into, and so we tend to bias it a bit. We have a strong bias into China at the moment because China is hard, and not enough the US because we're cheap. We find it hard to get US eyeballs, so we have a campaign that says US only, and Google tries very, very hard to meet that objective. And generally, we run about 25 million placements a day, every day, 7 days a week. So it's quite an extraordinary amount of ads. Here is a breakdown of our ad system across basically a 26-hour period. And what I'm doing is charting the ads that we get placed in each minute, no, sorry, in each second across a number of locales: Asia Pacific, America, Europe, India, and South America, Latin America. That's the total up the top. And we're doing round about 300 to 350 ad impressions every second. And you see the sort of the 1 hour breakdowns as the ad system comes up at the start of the hour, tries to achieve its objectives. Then when the hour is finished, they tail off and the new ad system actually works. If we follow India, and there's a lot of users in India, so this yellow graph, we tend to sort of cover India roughly between 50 to 100 ads per second every single day. Even in the off times, we still get a decent amount of advertising placement, even when everyone else is sleeping. There are still some folk out there who desperately want to see ads. Good on them. What can we do in the ad? Well, not much. I can fetch a URL, but that's enough, because what do users do? They fetch URLs. Do they do anything else? Not really. But when you fetch a URL, you've got to do a DNS question and an HTML question. So if I'm the DNS server and the HTML server, I get to see every part of your transaction. I'm the other end. And so, as I said earlier, if we use the unique DNS names, I defeat caching. And while I can't instrument the client, I instrument the server like crazy, full packet capture, everything. And all the data analysis is based on the logs collected by the server, where we infer actions at the client end. So normally in an ad, when you get one of our ads, you get about 10 tests. They're invisible. There's nothing happening on the screen. You can't see it happening. Um, we tried 20, but users get bored. It takes too long. It doesn't work as well. 10 seems to be optimal for us. We give them some URLs. One of them is, this is dual stack, and I'm interested to see which protocol you prefer, v4 or v6. A standard control one, you can get this in v4 because everyone seems to support v4. A second one, which is v6 only. And after a few other tests, including DNSSEC, 10 seconds later, I say, look, if you've kept the ad running for 10 seconds, please tell me how you're going. So the 10-second timer, and then basically a summary result report ad that kind of, the results are actually bedded into the query string. All of our servers are dual stack. They all use unique labels, and the actual name itself, the URL, determines behaviors. So here is actually a screenshot of an ad. It's a standard URL. The ad says, go to this URL and collect some instructions. And there you see a set of encoded instructions. And they look a lot like URLs. It starts saying HTTP, don't believe it. It's all HTTPS. And inside here is a whole bunch of rather lengthy labels. Now, Google insists, because they're Google, that the variable part of those target URLs can only be one label long and must end in a constant string. So you notice they're all separated by hyphens, not dots, and they all end in the string -0 dot. And that makes Google happy. So when Google's happy, we're happy. And all the rest of the test is actually embedded inside that label. So think of a DNS name as a piece of microcode. It's like coding up a machine, except now the machine is our server, and it's the DNS label that's being presented to it that says, here's what you're going to have to do to respond. The leading 0 says, do this straight away. We can change that into another letter and it will say, wait for a few seconds if we want a sec delay. The next one, V6, dual stack, V4. In this case, it's a V6 only. The S, this particular DNS name is signed with DNSSEC and it's valid. It's valid signature. So if you're doing DNSSEC validation, I expect to see that happen. We present the user with 10 different ads of varying forms. They all have this same field. If we go back a slide, you'll see that second field is the same for every single member of that collection. But if you run this another time, you'll see a different value. That way I can track you, and even the next time you run an ad, you will become a different person. I want to know where you are, so I geolocate you into a country. Country 13 is Australia. I'd like to know which network you came from, and so that next field is hex encoded. I happen to be connected to Telstra AS1221. In ASCII, 1221 is 4C5. Interestingly, I encode the time of day. I don't know if you've ever looked at the DNS, but the DNS is the most remarkable piece of random access memory that we've ever invented. When you ask the DNS a question, the DNS tends to never forget it. And we actually find that question gets replayed from various caches and log servers again and again and again. Even 6 months later, I can still see some of these queries. A year later, they're still around. Indeed, up to around 40% of the traffic on the DNS is nonsense. It's old stuff. No one's waiting for it. It's just filling up space. Putting the time field in a DNS name gives you an insight into the rather bizarre behavior of the DNS. Fascinating. And last and not least, because I'm trying to map V4 and V6, I've actually got the user's V4 address encoded in hex, just so if you come to me on V6, I know who you were in V4 as well, so I can match the two, which is kind of useful at times. So like I said, the DNS label is actually a piece of microcode. We don't send all the ads to one server. That server would melt. We use Akamai, except for Hong Kong where we use Amazon. We run a standard collection of Linux hosts in those cities and try and localize it. So if you're in South America, you'll have a conversation with Sao Paulo. If you're in India, in theory, routing notwithstanding, you'll have a conversation with servers in Mumbai, and similarly for the others around the world. And we try and sort of guess what is the closest. And so these are standard VMs on what used to be a service called Linode. Akamai bought it, so it's now with Akamai. You can use any kind of Linux-based server platform to make this work. So what do we get back? We get back an HTTP access log. Who did things? We get back a DNS query log. Who asked us questions? And we get back all the packets. So per server per day, there's quite a few gigs of data that we then have to plow through. So what kind of things are we plowing through? Well, for V6, for example, we send them a V6 only URL. If they can fetch that, that's good. They have V6, big tick. We also send them a dual stack URL, and we're interested to see which protocol they prefer to fetch that dual stack, V4, V6. And that way we can measure V6 preferred. They used V6 to go to a dual stack URL. We aggregate this data by your network, the origin AS. We aggregate it by country, as you've seen earlier. And so we have a picture not just of you, the user, because that really doesn't matter. What we have a picture of is the amount of V6 in particular service provider networks and in particular regions, countries and regions, to actually compare service providers against each other. And we do a certain amount of rudimentary compensation for ad placement. We normalize the country data against the estimates of national user populations so that we can talk about meaningful percentages. And we do something that almost no one else ever does. we make it public. Anyone can get this data. There's no restrictions on it. And I find that the most astonishing, frustrating part of most internet measurements from day one until now. Most folk who do an awful lot of measurement think it's a secret. They never, ever, ever tell. I try and tell everything all at once. My borderline is I don't do individual ad results. That's too close to personally identifying information. But aggregates at a network and a country level, it's all there. It's all available. It's all public. So what do we get? Here's the time series of V6 since 2014. The blue is capable. The red is preferred. And as you notice, there's always a gap of a few percentage points where some users have V6, but when given the choice, they'll use V4 for a variety of reasons. But, it's always been there. Right now, around 36% of the world, in fact, no, it's about 38, I think, at the moment, is capable of doing V6, and that's a great thing. Where? Well, I know which country, and here's a map of the world by country, and it's pretty clear that there's an awful lot of V6 in India. There's a certain amount of V6 in Saudi Arabia, although fewer people. Japan, Malaysia, Vietnam, America, not so much. France and Germany, definitely. All of Africa, no. A lot of the Far East, Asia, Russia, Middle East, generally tending to no. China, they're getting there. Not fairly, but they're getting there. So oddly enough, it's not the internet. Once you start doing these kind of maps, you start to realize the internet is astonishingly heterogeneous. And the economic pressures in one part of the world are very, very different to the economic pressures in another. And that actually reflects in the adoption of technologies. And so the country tables, 80% of India has V6, 72% of Malaysia. Other countries, I think, are a bit surprising. Nepal, not the world's richest country, in fact, definitely not, but around 58% of their users have V6. So a number of countries have sort of done amazing things. My country, Australia, not there, not in that top 20 or so. Just haven't felt the need to do anything, which is a bit sad in so many ways. And here's the blow up for India. I think I showed that at the start of this pack. The big effort was across 2017, where it basically went from nothing to almost completely deployed. And the last few years, it's just been a case of fill in. I don't think the numbers are really going to get any higher. And, Bharti Airtel, Reliance Jio, Vodafone and Idea have led the charge. But interestingly, once the biggies go, everyone else kind of has a problem, don't they? And when you look at this table, the real question is BSNL, where are you? Hello. And Excitel Broadband, again, where are you? And it is those ones that stand out. Everyone else is kind of going, yeah, we know how to do this. We're on the track. But yes, a few of them are still hanging out in India. Here's Reliance Jio, and it's the time graph for Reliance Jio alone. And you can see for Reliance, the big sort of predominant work was across 2015. And then interestingly, in what must have been an astonishing 4 weeks, they just turned it on. Across the entire national network, they just turned it on from 20% to 60% in under a month. It must have been an exciting month. Bit of a backlash, and then off they go again. And these days, a very stable network running V6, and it's about 96% of users run V6 inside Reliance Jio. Again, astonishing achievement. So DNSSEC, same kind of picture. I have 2 tests, a DNSSEC signed name and a DNSSEC signed name where the signature is nonsense. It won't validate. If you're running a validating DNS resolver, that URL that starts with 0DI for invalid will not resolve. You will not be able to retrieve that URL. So you're sitting behind a DNSSEC validating resolver if it fetches all of those URLs, but it does not fetch the one that's been pointed to by the invalidly signed. And I see those queries for the DNSSEC OK field and the DNS key record. Um, People have a number of resolvers, sort of operational practice that clients typically have two or three recursive resolvers. And it's often the practice that one of them validates, but the other one doesn't, which is actually really frustrating because the one that validates says that's a bad name. I will not resolve that. And the client goes, well, I'll just try the other resolver then. And that doesn't validate. So that'll give me the answer. And so we actually get with DNSSEC sort of three, three answers. Um, the ones in blue, and it's about 35, 36% of the world, do not resolve a name if it's invalidly signed. They don't, because all their resolvers perform validation. But this red line is mixed. I can see that they're trying to do validation, and the answer is, well, that's a dud. And then they go, it's okay. I have another resolver over here that doesn't validate. I want that name resolved. And around 9% of the world's users go, not a problem. You kind of go, why did you bother? If the answer was bad and DNSSEC was bad, there's no point asking a resolver that doesn't do the test. That's just a waste of everyone's time. It's a bad answer. And that's still a persistent and annoying sort of 8 to 9%. The total of the blue and the red is this orange at around 42%. Where does DNSSEC validation happen? Look at that. Compare it to this. V6, I wouldn't say it's a rich country game, but it's certainly a game where the rich countries tend to be there, plus a few others in the Asia Pacific area. And none of Africa. Look at DNSSEC. It's a different picture. There's a huge amount across Africa, even in the Middle East, Pakistan, India, less so. Mongolia, I'm just there. Even Russia is kind of going there. The Scandies, but it's a completely different sort of socio-economic picture for those people doing DNSSEC validation. In India, Reliance Jio, fantastic. Bharti Airtel, not. Just, nah, don't do that. Vodafone, yeah, we're there. ICLnet, yeah, half in, half out. BSNL, they don't do V6, but around 30% of the users do DNSSEC. Go figure. I can't. So, mixed picture with DNSSEC in India. And, Railtel, the railways in a network service provider, they've got DNSSEC turned on. They may not have V6, but they have DNSSEC. Kind of wonder what's going on there. I don't have any answers. What other things can we do if we want to measure stuff? Well, I've worked up this procedure using what we call glueless DNS, where I give you this name service of a domain, but don't tell you their IP addresses. The resolver has actually got to separately resolve those names and will only recontinue with the major exercise when they successfully resolve the name. That way, we can get the DNS to report on whether the DNS worked. It's a very fascinating technique to sort of intrude reporting into the DNS. Do you support internationalized domain names? Do you do query name minimization? How do you go with really, really big answers in the DNS? What's your dual stack resolver, etc.? All this can be done with glueless DNS. And we've done a lot of experiments around that area. The other one we've had a lot of trouble with, but eventually managed to work it through. There's this new protocol called QUIC. These days, it's fashionably called HTTP3. But the way browsers react to this differs. Chrome will not try to use HTTP3 by default. It relies on receiving a content directive saying, hi, I've delivered this to you using HTTP2, but if you really want it and you come back to me soon enough and you remember, I'll be able to do this in HTTP3. So it only uses HTTP3 on the second fetch. So if I'm trying to measure the number of users in a country that can use QUIC, then I have to create a behavior that pushes the user to ask that URL multiple times with a small idle interval. And so we sort of programmed it up to be able to do that. I'm interested in the kind of resolvers that everyone uses. How many folk in India use Google's DNS? for example. And we programmed up a resolver that only ever answers serve fail to try and make the end client ask every single resolver that's been configured. So I get to see which resolvers have been configured for you. Which resolvers could you use? Normally, you'll just take the best answer. But if the first one returns serve fail and the second and the third, ultimately at some point, I will see in my server all of the resolvers that you have configured. IPv6 mangling. There's been a very, very healthy debate lately as to whether IPv6 extension headers and IPv6 fragmentation actually works or not. And by doing IPv6 packet mangling at the server side, I can craft IPv6 packets with header extensions and then see if they make it back to you, the user, and whether you can do something with them. For extension headers, the answer is you can't, you won't, don't bother, it doesn't work. And so the kind of projects that we've done over the time, performance, fragmentation, header extensions, various encryption technologies, ECDSA, EDDI algorithms, fragmentation drop, TCP support, and so on. Oddly enough, all of those things are susceptible for measurement using this technique because you craft the situation in the server and see if the user can actually complete the fetch of that URL. So this is a server-side measurement. The other systems that are around are what we'd call client-side measurements, Cadus Arc, RIPE Atlas, and so on. Create the measurement at the client side in a dedicated machine and sort of probe the network's infrastructure and measure at the client side. In this server-side measurement, I can only do a few things, but I can instrument it very precisely and get very rich measurement from a huge collection of end users. And so this way, you know, I can trigger the problem and then observe the outcome against the known cause. Client-side measurements are kind of unable to trigger the problem so easily and are left trying to infer it from behaviors. So it's sort of looking at the same problem from two sides. I think the server side is actually easier to work with, but I say that from the benefit of about 15 years experience. So I've still got a few minutes left for question. Hopefully you found that interesting. I've gone through it relatively quickly, but as I said, hopefully you found that if you have any questions, I would be keen to try and answer them or continue the discussion. So let me open up the floor for any questions, please.
Thank you so much, Mr. Huston. Are there any questions in the room? Okay, I don't see any questions at the moment. I think they are still trying to comprehend the wealth of knowledge that they've just received. Okay, can you please come to the mic over here and introduce yourself and ask the question?
Good afternoon, sir. I'm Devraj. I mostly work with security aspects with enterprise security. So I have seen in your presentation that India has very less amount of use case of DNSSEC in compared to global aspect. So if you can let everyone know what's the threat aspect of that and what are the policies and what are the methods where Indian internal governance and other parties, they can take the initiative seriously to implement those. Thank you.
Thank you. You know, it's a great question, and you probably asked the wrong person, because I actually think security is a discussion. There are very few absolutes, very, very few absolutes. The whole idea behind DNSSEC is incredibly good. If someone is trying to send you fake answers, and it's incredibly easy to do that, DNSSEC will allow you to detect that it's a fake because the signature doesn't work and you can discard the answer. That's fantastic. So let me understand this and place it in context. I want to go to www.google.com and DNSSEC says, you'll be given the answer, 10.1.1.1, and it's a good answer. And I go, great. I'm going to send my packet to 10.1.1.1 and I'm going to believe the answer. Well, wrong. Because if there's a routing attack going on, how do I know that whatever answered was Google? DNSSEC won't tell me that. It only tells me if the mapping was good, but it doesn't tell me if the service was right. And the whole thing about DNSSEC is it's half of the solution. What is the answer? All of you and me rely on TLS. We rely on transport level security because we don't care what address we're talking to. What we want is the other end to say, I'm google.com, and here is a signature to set up this session that you can check against your trust anchors to believe that I am part of the google.com secret cabal. And so the world actually relies on TLS, not DNSSEC. So DNSSEC has enjoyed a mixed blessing. A lot of folk do it because it's called security and security is always good and more is better, right? Yet www.google.com is not DNSSEC signed. Why not? Because DNSSEC is not a very reliable protocol. And that's part of the measurements that I've been doing, because when you start putting big answers into the DNS, big answers, UDP fails. UDP kind of goes, oh, it's too big for me. You have to go to TCP. But a whole bunch of resolvers hate going to TCP. It takes time, it's very unreliable, and so on. So the real question is, why do I need DNSSEC when I'm already using TLS? I've gone to Let's Encrypt, I've got my certificate, I can prove I'm me. I don't care what address I'm at, I am me. And kind of that's one of these issues around trying to distinguish between the service and the elements of technology. DNSSEC was only half the solution, and a number of folk have done it as a box ticking exercise, and good on them, but it's not very reliable, it's not very fast, it has its problems, and to be perfectly frank, and this is my opinion, only mine, just Geoff's, not worth the money. It's not worth the effort. So I'm behind the folk who haven't bothered. It's just kind of, it's just a lot of complication. You don't need it. But, others have other opinions because, like I said, security is a conversation, not a set of answers. So, my answer is the folk who haven't done it, that's fine. They're not missing out on anything. The users aren't missing out on anything. As long as you've got TLS running, you're kind of okay, kind of, better than nothing. And that's the answer that, all 7 billion of us rely on. So, that's the story today.
Yeah, hello Jeff. This is Anand from India Tech Foundation. One question from DNSSEC perspective only. The RSA and other algorithms which are not quantum safe. ICON is working on some PQC in the future. So, what's your take on that? Where this will land up?
The whole security thing is based around the concept of how long do you need to keep a secret. If I want to send you an important matter of state politics and I want it to be a secret for 20 years, then I have to choose an encryption algorithm that will keep it a secret for computers built 20 years into the future. Now, I can look at Moore's law, doubling of compute capacity every 18 months. If I was going to just assume linear computing and 20 years, I probably need to use RSA 4096 or one of the big elliptical curve ones, not P256, probably 512 or 1024. Because in 20 years' time, those computers are going to be an awful lot bigger than the ones today. So I know what to do. But 20 years' time brings this other massive uncertainty. Because if Google or Microsoft or the US government or your government or my government, or whoever else has got quantum computing programs going on, if they ever crack this, if they ever crack it, then most of the algorithms we're using today are blown. And if I want this secret to be a secret 20 years from now, I have to use post-quantum algorithms today. And that is why Google Chrome is equipped already with, I think it's Sphinx, one of the candidate post-quantum algorithms today. Because if you want to encrypt a message and keep it a secret for at least 20 years, You've got to think about that today. And that's fine if that's your game. But now let's look at DNSSEC encryption and post-quantum cryptography. Are any of you vaguely interested in DNS queries from 20 years ago? And the answer is no one. DNS is a here today, gone tomorrow kind of world. You need to keep it secret, even if it is a secret, for about a day, maybe 2 days if you're really, really paranoid. But DNSSEC is an ephemeral technology. So I don't need 20 years of secrecy for DNSSEC. And so in terms of post-quantum cryptography and the DNS, the answer is I can wait. Unlike Chrome, I haven't got 20-year secrets that I need to keep. I've got, 2-hour secrets. And quite frankly, anything, even RSA 1024, is perfectly fine for that kind of work. And so, post-quantum cryptography has a very real application in things that need to be held secret for a long time, i.e. 20 years, because that reality is impinging on us right now. But for things that are here today, gone tomorrow, like the DNS, nah, just isn't a problem today. It's a problem we can safely sleep on for another couple of decades before we need to worry about it. That being said, it's a nightmare. Even Chrome is trying hard to figure out how to do massive keys. It's all about 10 times bigger. And that stresses out TCP handshakes. It stresses out a huge amount of our technology trying to do post-quantum cryptography in things like Chrome on standard TCP. The rest of the infrastructure is struggling to cope. But if anyone ever succeeds in building one of these machines or 10 of them, we all have a problem. Good question. Thank you.
Mr. Huston, thank you so much for joining today and giving us this excellent talk on internet measurements. The wealth of data that you have accumulated over the years and the very interesting results have given us a lot to think about. We thank you once again for your time.
Thanks indeed. And thank you. I hope it's been a useful.
Mr. Huston, thank you so much for joining today and giving us this excellent talk on internet measurements. The wealth of data that you have accumulated over the years and the very interesting results have given us a lot to think about. We thank you once again for your time.
Thanks indeed. And thank you. I hope it's been a useful.